Good morning, Daniel.
Morning, Dan.
What are we chatting about today?
A little bit off the beaten path today. Let's talk about income and minimum wage.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it.
Okay, we're just talking about like making minimum wage. We're talking about making more than minimum wage. Where do we want to go with this?
There's been some recent updates, changes, and thoughts in regard to minimum wage, especially here in Longmont and Colorado. Figured first and foremost, we just talk about what it is, where it's being changed potentially, who it impacts, and who benefits from it. That being said, I figured we just start first with what is minimum wage today? What's the history of it?
I mean, simply put, minimum wage, and I think anybody listening is going to know what that is. But minimum wage is, at least in dollar terms, right, $7.25 federally, and that was set back in 2009. And then in Colorado, it's currently $14.81 an hour, and then that increases essentially by inflation or by CPI as measured every year. And then in Boulder County, specifically unincorporated Boulder County, so not City of Longmont, not City of Boulder or Erie or something like that, it's actually 1657. And then they're increasing it a little bit more aggressively than that. And City of Boulder has its own minimum wage, and there's a couple other kind of nits and picks in the local area.
Okay, and it's my understanding that minimum wage is supposed to be for those just starting a job or teenagers. Is that correct?
That's sort of the interesting comment or sort of belief, and I think we've just gotten there culturally. Minimum wage was created almost 100 years ago, back in the kind of late 30s, on the tail end of the Great Depression, and that was essentially at the time 25 cents an hour, which of course sounds crazy, but in modern dollars that was about 5.72. And then it was actually escalating then for the next 6 or 7 years into the mid 40s, where it got up to the modern equivalent to about 7.17. So technically the minimum wage set in 2009 is effectively greater than the minimum wage that was set at the end of the initial minimum wage when you adjust for inflation.
All right. That being said, are there more or less people on minimum wage today as a percentage of the total population than maybe in the past?
So there's less people on minimum wage today insofar as like the proportion of the population. We also have record low unemployment right now, or very low unemployment, but it's sort of a weird dynamic in which unemployment technically is measured by the percentage of the population requesting unemployment as opposed to the number of people who are unemployed. So you have sort of this idea of people who've fallen out of the workforce as opposed to people who are actually unemployed and trying to get a job. I can say, just speaking of kind of local business owners and the local business environment, pretty much everywhere is hiring in some way, shape, or form, particularly in your retail, your restaurant, so on and so forth. And so I think realistically, today, if you look at who is making minimum wage, it's largely going to be people who are like tipped workers who are making a slightly lower minimum wage, but who are then actually taking home more money than the minimum wage based on their tip income and so on.
Right. A lot of restaurant and service workers, I'd assume. I remember we talked about the big beautiful bill in our last conversation, and there were some updates and amendments to overtime and tip income. How does something like this factor into the equation there?
It's actually interesting because it does not explicitly factor into it, right? Like the big beautiful bill did not touch on minimum wage and say like you have to be a minimum wage person to then benefit from the overtime or the tip tax exemptions, right? You just have to be below a certain level of income, which you're miles from that level if you actually genuinely make minimum wage, even with tip wages. The interesting thing is that, when the labor law was passed, including minimum wage back in the 30s, it was the same law that also introduced the concept of overtime, the idea that we have today, where if you work for more than 12 hours in a day, or if you work more than 40 hours a week, you have to be paid a premium for that time. All of that sort of flowed through in the law at the time, because what they were trying to get to was a minimum threshold of living, but also what they were trying to get to was an understanding of essentially that we need to get more employment. And so the idea of capping work at 12 hours a day or 40 hours a week was less to do with trying to give those people who did it more money and more about disincentivizing employers from hiring extra people.
Okay. And you mentioned how this is adjusted for inflation or CPI, and Colorado's minimum wage is pretty high compared to the federal minimum wage, and even just Boulder County's on track to be almost 2 to 3 times more than the average in the next couple years here. What does that mean for the area and just the minimum wage in general?
So the interesting thing is that, because the CPI adjustment keeps going on in perpetuity, we sort of have what is going to be an inflation-based minimum wage or de facto minimum wage forever, unless the federal government or something changes and they jump past it in some way, shape, or form. In Boulder County, it's sort of on this accelerated track. And in Colorado, there was a law passed in 2009 or 2019, excuse me, that allowed cities and municipalities to go ahead and accelerate either by up to 15% a year or up to $1.75 per year, but only the greater of the two, right? So you could do up to 15%, and if 15% was less than $1.75, you could do up to $1.75, and if 15% is greater than $1.75, you can just do 15%. Boulder County is on track to essentially get all the way up to essentially a maximum amount of $25 an hour 5 years from now in 2030. And the city of Boulder is doing the same thing, but a little more gradually. They're doing it where the minimum wage is set to increase by 15.57 this year. So it's about 60, 70 cents past the state wage. And then it's going to keep jumping a little bit more to 1682 and then 1817 over the next 2 years. And all of this is just sort of accelerating in a way where, the labor market is self-adjusting. Like the de facto minimum wage in Boulder County right now is more like $16 to $18 an hour. Most people are not going to work for less than that, except in special circumstances. And if you go apply at like Walmart or Target, that's what you're going to get paid minimum. If you go work at Wendy's, I think it's $20 an hour. So like you can definitely make the minimum wage or more in low skill retail, service jobs, etc. But it creates an interesting effect because there's a compression that happens, right? When the minimum amount of money people can earn is at a certain level, then it starts to rise and rise and rise and rise. What happens at upper levels of income where people go, well, I was making good money relative to the overall labor market, but now I'm making a lot less money relative to the overall labor market because I was making, let's say, 50, and people making minimum wage were making 28, but now they're going to be making 45, and now I feel like I'm a lot closer to minimum wage than I used to be, and that's going to shift my perception of what my income is and how much I deserve.
So you think there's almost like a comparison part of it too, just seeing what other people are earning relative to what you're earning?
There's always a comparison thing, right? Like if I said, Daniel, you're really well paid, right? You're making $79,000 a year, outside of benefits and bonus comp and all of that. By the way, the people at Target who stock the shelves are going to be making $70,000 a year. You would probably not feel quite as well compensated or remunerated in your role for your skills and talent and going to college and all of that as you do today.
I guess that's fair. Uh, so how is this impacting Longmont? From what I've read and heard and discussed, they're making some decisions themselves.
So the city of Longmont has been under pressure for the last year, particularly by sort of the Boulder County commissioners who passed the first minimum wage acceleration here in the county, essentially to go ahead and pick up their minimum wage quite a bit, or to align with the county. And the argument that was being made there was like, well, if you don't raise your minimum wage, then all the minimum wage people from your city are going to leave your city and go somewhere else. But the inverse has sort of been happening. What we've seen is a lot of businesses in unincorporated Boulder County are either consolidating employees, right? We're going from multiple part-time people to a handful of full-time people, or in some cases they're just closing up entirely. So, city council here in Longmont has not made a decision to accelerate the minimum wage, but they are under political pressure to do it from outside entities.
All right. So at the end of the day, what's the big deal? Are there people that are severely impacted by this, or is it just as simple as raise the minimum wage, people make a little bit more money?
I mean, there's two sides to every coin. I'll use Niwot as an example. So even though there's the town of Niwot just south of us here in Longmont, it's technically unincorporated. It's not a real town. at least like in a political, legal structure sense. And the consequence of that is that they are subject to the unincorporated Boulder County minimum wage requirement. And so, just since the start of this year, when the minimum wage kicked in the county, there's three businesses that have closed that were all employing minimum wage, service employee type folks. 50 jobs have been lost between those businesses and a couple other businesses in the community. It's estimated that over $2 million of wages have been lost. Now, I'm hopeful that the people who lost their jobs, closed the businesses, et cetera, have been able to pivot to other jobs, other places, and find other opportunities. But just to be clear, as of July, right, or July 1st of this year, right, in the first 6 months of the year, there's $2 million less that people have earned or been able to earn, despite the fact that their income was supposed to be able to go up as a result of this law and so on. The other side of this is, yes, right, there are people who are still employed, who are still being paid minimum wage, who are making more now. So there's a net factor here that we have to kind of be able to balance or think about here. But like the city of Denver, when they did their acceleration starting back in 2021, they have had 411 restaurants close net, right? So they haven't just had 411 close and 200 have opened. Like net of all the restaurants that have opened in Denver, 411 restaurants don't exist anymore.
Wow, that's a pretty staggering statistic. Hearing something like that makes me realize and start thinking about something like tips. When you see the percentage that we are obligated or socially pressured to pay to restaurant employees when we tip, it seems like a downstream impact or effect of just this conversation here.
Well, there's an interesting thing in Colorado, which is our Constitution says that the tip credit is no greater than $3.08. And what that means is, tipped employees cannot be paid anything less than $3.08 below the prevailing minimum wage in any area. And then that tips are allowed to make up the difference. But when they passed that law, they passed it at the same time that Colorado did its last minimum wage sort of activity back in the 2000s, when the minimum wage they tried to set before the federal minimum wage was about $7. So at the time, tips were allowed to make up something like 40%, 45% of your earnings as a tipped employee. And today, that tip assumption is still $3.08, but the minimum wage has now gone up something like 400% from where it was 20 years ago relative to the tipped employee level. At the same time, tipped employees, their income can vary quite a bit. But like I know the owner of 300 Sons here in Longmont, nice brewery restaurant, said that on a nice Friday or Saturday evening, their front of house staff are making something like $30 to $50 an hour in tips. So it's an interesting dynamic where simultaneously, the people who are supposedly in the greatest need for a minimum wage increase are simultaneously the people who are potentially not in need of it. And what we saw in a study that was done last year is that people earning minimum wage were actually less favorable of raising the minimum wage, but it was people who were just a little further ahead of them. So, people making $14 to $16 an hour, not in favor of a minimum wage increase, but people making $20 to $25 an hour were in favor of a minimum wage increase. And I think that goes back to that sort of compression effect that we touched on earlier.
That's pretty interesting. The fact that it's not the people actually earning the minimum, it's the people just below the minimum. So when I think about this, right, it seems like a lot of service industries and restaurants are going to be severely impacted negatively. So, who is actually supporting this and driving the increases here?
So the basic groups that sort of pushed for this in the first place in the Boulder County area, one was it was sort of interesting. It was like a DBA sort of situation where it was like one guy in one office in Denver working for something that was called like the local labor coalition or something like that. But it was literally like a single guy. That guy and that organization were actually a subsidiary of the Service Employees Industry Union, which is the largest union in the world, covers literally millions of employees in businesses from everything from janitors to front desk reception people to housekeepers. Like millions of people are covered by this organization. But they pushed for Boulder to increase their minimum wage quite a bit. And then they also kind of formed a coalition with some nonprofits that serve, the homeless or food banks, that sort of thing, as well as some faith-based organizations, churches, that sort of thing. And that's really what kind of pushed it into Boulder County first. And then flowing from that now, we have more pressure from the city of Boulder and from the Boulder County commissioners, essentially to sort of get with the program. And that's sort of where a lot of the pressure is coming from.
All right, so unions businesses, churches, other non-religious organizations? Exactly what's in it for them?
I mean, I'm not trying to be anti-union or anti-nonprofit or anti-church or anything, but I mean, just speaking in sort of the realpolitik of what happens there. Unions typically make something like 1 to 3% of their employees, or not their employees, but their union members' income is the way that their dues are funded. So, if the union employees are, let's say, contractually guaranteed to make 25% above the minimum wage, and the union then gets paid 1% of their wages, and then their wages go up by 25-30%, then good news, the employees make that much more because the minimum wage has gone up, but also then the union's dues get to expand. Like it's sort of just a basic business decision on their part. Not to say it's a good or a bad thing, but that's sort of the basic mechanic there. On the part of churches, right? Churches regularly tithe their members, and so if their members are making more money, and they typically ask that you pay 5 or 10% of your income to the church, then again, the church is going to benefit from that. Maybe the same if we told all of our clients, you need to be $500,000 wealthier tomorrow because we charge as a percentage of net worth. And then in total fairness, right, for whether it's the churches or some of the other social nonprofits that work with food hunger or homelessness or those sorts of things, right? A lot of those problems are downstream of losses of jobs or losses of income or not having enough money to make ends meet, and so there's sort of an easy silver bullet thinking here that you can just raise minimum wage and that's going to magically solve that problem for a lot of folks.
When a change like this is discussed, I guess what's the impact of it, especially here in Longmont?
Oh, I mean, here in Longmont, I think the simple answer is probably every restaurant is currently terrified. When they did the minimum wage study for the county last year, there was an expectation that, broadly speaking, increasing the minimum wage would increase overhead for businesses by like 0.5% generally, over the next 5 or 6 years. But that restaurants would have something, or sorry, and actually that's a misrepresentation. It was like 3% for all businesses in general, their overhead would go up. But for restaurants specifically, it would go up by about 23%. So you're talking about, hey, labor is your biggest cost as a restaurant or as a service business. And I can say, I sat in the city council meeting last year when they first entertained doing a minimum wage increase. I've sat in a focus group at the Longmont Chamber in the last couple of weeks. And every restaurant representing there is scared out of their minds. And we're not talking about people saying like, oh, I'm not going to be able to afford my Ferrari. There was a restaurant owner who literally lives in the apartment above their restaurant, right, who used to have 40 staff and now has 25 staff, who used to, charge less per plate and make more money, per person who came in, and today has to charge more per plate and still makes less money per person who comes into the restaurant. Talking to people who've had to let people go and fill in the hours in a smaller food establishment or a smaller entertainment establishment. So I think, a lot of the quality of life things we enjoy, the Roost, 99 Saloon, Quarters, the Pump House, all these various places around here, I think they are all rightfully concerned that they could be put at pretty substantial risk if they're suddenly forced to accelerate wages dramatically. I think the professional or skilled labor businesses like ours are less concerned. But for those businesses that maybe hire a couple teenagers for the summer or something like that, that there's kind of a business question here about like, well, I was happy to give a kid their first chance, but if it's going to cost me 20, 30, 40% more in a rapid period of time, that's kind of shifts from being a luxury to being a bit of a problem. And so from that standpoint, you might see a bit of work role job consolidation, and then just the general broad thing. And I don't want to play a small violin for my fellow business owners, but the state gives us something new to do essentially every year, something new to pay for every year. We have the family program as far as the paid family medical leave. You have new compliance requirements. You have new unemployment surcharges, like the uninsurance tax we have to pay at the state level for payroll this year essentially doubled because so much unemployment has been paid for over the last 5-6 years because of COVID and whatnot that the state needs to replenish it. And so they're just saying, hey, good news, business owners, you get to double what you pay us this year to help us make up for some of the shortfalls in those programs. And so the trick is, is minimum wage going to be the thing that drives a business out of business? Hopefully not. But is minimum wage on top of X, Y, and Z potentially enough to tip something over? Yeah, I mean, it's a real risk.
All right, so that's a lot. I guess what can people on either side do about it?
I mean, basic answer here is, you have to make a decision. If you're on the labor side of this equation, you're probably, I don't want to say indifferent to the minimum wage conversation, right? If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, it is what it is. But if your question or your concern is like, hey, how do I do better? The basic answer is improve your human capital, right? Go out there, go to school, learn a trade, right? You don't see electricians, plumbers, carpenters making minimum wage. You don't see people with accounting degrees making minimum wage. You don't see people working in banks making minimum wage, right? It's about being more valuable in general so that you can command a better price instead of just making what any random employer offers you, and they're going to offer you the sort of the minimum of the scale. And from a business standpoint, the basic answer is that they're going to have to pay market rate for people's wages and time, whether the minimum wage goes up or not, right? There is a de facto value, right? I mentioned sort of the de facto minimum wage in Boulder County. Every job has a reasonable minimum wage, right? Like if I told you, Daniel, tomorrow I'm going to cut your salary down to $20,000 a year, you'd be like, well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm out, right? You're not going to put up with that. But on the other side of that, like you can't just say, well, I want to make $1 million a year, Dan. Like it's just not fair market value. The business couldn't support it. And even if it could, you're great, but you're not worth $1 million a year today. You might be one day, but not today.
All right, so that kind of touches a lot on the employee side. If you're an employee, what you can do, and mainly just stems from increase the value of your human capital. But what about from a business standpoint, whether planning for the future of the business or just how it reacts and interacts with your plan in general?
I mean, the biggest thing is that you've just got to really start to build out more and more buffer and more space in your business plan. There's sort of this joke we have in the financial planning world where we talk about people like how much they save for retirement. We say like, look, if the government just raised your income taxes by 5%, you'd just have to eat it. You'd have no choice. So you should save that much more in your 401k. Well, when I look at my fellow business owners and whether they run a small restaurant or store or whatever it is, it's sort of the same thing. It's like, look, the government is running the very real risk of telling you that you have to pay thousands of dollars more per person per year based on the minimum wage considerations. And even if you don't pay minimum wage today, but you have some employees who are $3, $4, $5 above it today, if they don't get raises, then they're going to get closer and closer to the minimum wage as it increases. And so then you're going to run the risk of losing them. But on the other side of that as well, you just need to plan or make the assumption that somebody may make a decision where suddenly your tax, quote unquote, to use the earlier metaphor, is just going to be going up overnight, and you're going to either have to go out of business or you're going to have to find a way to eat it. So you need to plan around how you're going to be flexible, or you have to try to build more margin, build more buffer into your existing business model so that you can react and absorb those potential costs as they happen.
So it sounds like if you're a business, essentially build the buffer. If you're an employee, essentially be more valuable.
Well, and be more valuable like is a super like blase sort of way to put it, but like I'll tell you, speaking from a business owner perspective and speaking to other business owners all the time, and this is going to be a very blunt way of putting it, but like you could be more valuable to a business just by giving a little bit more of a fuck. And not to be too crude about it, but like there's just an enormous issue with employees in all sorts of industries and all sorts of businesses who at a certain level of skill, whether it's entry level, whether it's minimum wage, however you want to look at it or measure it, but there's a lot of people who just sort of have this like, I'm not making that much money, you don't pay me enough to care, so I don't. Like your cash register cashier, or you work at a store or something, and you just put the absolute minimum effort forward. And like I get that. Like I worked in retail in high school. I understand that like it is not a thrilling thing, and you're not super pumped and jazzed and excited to be there, and you'd rather be doing probably anything else. But the truth of the matter is, if you're going to wait for the government to increase minimum wage or accelerate minimum wage to improve your financial lot, that is what it's going to take to improve your financial lot. If you lean in and you try to give an extra effort, you're in sales and you try to do upselling, you are, somebody responsible for managing a store or helping out with inventory, right? Go above and beyond and don't just wait for somebody to tell you what to do. If you are responsible for things that can cost the business money, if you make mistakes, be more careful, be more cautious, be more conscientious about it. But for lack of a better phrase, like the morale hazard factor cuts both ways. If you were indifferent to the health and outcomes of the business, don't be surprised when the business doesn't have much to offer you or isn't inclined to offer you much. And in turn, right, if you put in that much more effort, if you work a little bit harder, if you, again, give a fuck, you'd be amazed at how grateful even a small business owner can be. And I'm not trying to say like, if you do X, you're going to get Y. But it's just like, look, it's the reality of the thing. If you put it forth more effort, you're likely to be a little bit luckier in the outcomes you obtain.
Yeah, and the funny thing about everything you just mentioned is none of those things require extra school or extra learning. They're all controllable. It's, your attitude, it's your ability to make less mistakes and be more careful, be responsible, and like you said, care.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use the Jewish phrase, right? To like just be a mensch, right? Like some small business owner, right? Some family of four has opened up this store, this little mom and pop restaurant or whatever it is, and you might not love it. It may not be the best job you've ever had or anything like that, but like they're putting everything on the line to have this business, and part of that is employing you, and be a mensch and try to return the favor a little bit by caring, at least half as much as they do. Maybe not as much as they do, but again, it's something where you can be remarkably successful if you just have the attitude that you want to be successful. And people, recognize that, right? I always like to point to you, Daniel, and say like you're not in the good or you're not in the bad mood having business. Like that's not nothing, right? It's not the only thing that you contribute, but it certainly is not ever going to cut against you that you always have a positive attitude and that you're always working hard.
All right, well, I got that going for me.
Among many other things, full head of hair.
So it's exciting but fearful, I'd say, the whole conversation here. Is there anything we haven't yet discussed pertaining to the minimum wage you think's worth mentioning here?
I think what I'll just say here, whether you're on the employee side of this, the business owner side of this, the regulator side, or the county politician side, or the city council side, whoever's listening, minimum wage is a tool, and it's an incredibly blunt instrument. I think there are a lot of problems, the various constituencies that are advocating for raising the minimum wage or accelerating the growth of the minimum wage since it's already raising every year anyway. I think there's a lot of problems that they hope and think and believe that raising the minimum wage will solve. Um, I am very skeptical of its ability to solve those things, particularly because you have sort of the wage price inflation spiral problem that can happen and has happened in big areas on like the West Coast and whatnot. But I think more than anything, you have to really focus on what you can control. Right? If you're the business owner, try to be leaner, try to be more efficient, try to be smarter about these sorts of risks that this could happen. And if you're the employee who could be positively affected by minimum wage, it behooves you to work hard enough or work well enough in your position to instead focus on increasing your income by the quality of your value as opposed to just waiting for the government to give you a step up.
All right, great.
Well, with all our pseudo political and economic commentary and social commentary handled here, I'll ask you my favorite question of the week, as always. Daniel, what have you learned this week that you think is important for people to share or think about?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I believe in the spring you went to an FPA conference, and one of your takeaways was that we as advisors, when we meet with clients via Zoom or online or phone call, feel it's a very productive use of time. However, clients feel it is a less productive use of time, to kind of paraphrase. And I think just over the coming weeks, months, or even really the last year and a quarter since I've been here, and we put an emphasis on community involvement, and obviously we have a brick and mortar office where we meet with clients. I think it's important to recognize and not underestimate or undersell how important the value of in-person human connection is. There's really just some things that can't be replicated or learned about a person online, and it's been one of my favorite things to dive into wholeheartedly, and something I hope clients value as much as we do.
No, and I think nothing really beats that in-person interaction. Not to say that it's not convenient or fun to meet people online or talk on the phone or whatever it is, but there's just something really warm and valuable about holding space for these important conversations we get to have.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of these subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.